Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and I suppose initially just to say thank you very much to Barry and to the National Federation for the invitation to come here this morning and to talk to you about the Drinking Water Directive, the recast which we're currently working on transposing into national legislation. You'll all be aware of the old directive, and it's supported by a raft of legislation. And I'm not going to go through it, but that's the long list that currently exists for the Drinking Water Directive. And what we're doing at the moment is we're taking the new directive, the 2020 directive, and that directive will be transposed into national legislation with a new set of drinking water regulations. And these drinking water regulations are currently being drafted. The timelines associated with the directive are as follows. The directive was adopted in December 2020, and I suppose it came into force in January 2021, and from that date we have 2 years to get it transposed into national law. And that January 2023 date is looming large on the horizon. So we're, as I said, working frantically in the background at the moment to get this piece of legislation prepared. Part of the process of, I suppose, developing the new regulations is about consultation and engagement with the experts that are, they're in this room, local authorities, other government departments, the EPA, Geological Survey. I mean, there's a long list there. It might be, I suppose, easier to look at that list just by their logos. But again, local authorities water programme are there, the local authorities are there through the CCMA, National Standards Authority, Irish Water, the National Federation. So all of these organisations have expertise across the drinking water sphere, and we're bringing all of that, I suppose, knowledge and experience into the one room and basically discussing how we develop the new regulations and what we include in it. And then these organisations are involved in subgroups of the main expert group, and they're looking at ultimately how we're going to implement the directive, because the first step is transposing it into national legislation, but the longer term aspect of this is actual implementation on a day-to-day basis. And like the old directive ran since '98, so these pieces of legislation and these directives last for 20 years. So we want to get it right at the beginning so that it stands the test of time, and it does what it says on the tin. And I suppose this is what it says on the tin. The directive's objectives are to protect human health from adverse effects of contamination of water for drinking. And that's unchanged. That's from the last directive. It still exists, and we continue to ensure there's clean and wholesome water. The second objective is a new objective. And it's to improve the access to water. And it is an issue here, probably more so of an issue in other countries in Europe. But again, it's a key part of the new directive. And in this, I suppose, presentation today, we're just going to look at some elements of the directive. And you'll see why I say some elements in a moment, because it's a very big document. So a lot of what was in the original Drinking Water Directive has been retained. So, like the definitions, the general obligations, the general drivers for the directive, they're all rolled into the new directive. They've been updated, they've been, I suppose, modernised, but they're still there, and we're still working to those standards, and some of them have been improved. But then there's a whole raft of new pieces of the directive, and those are the pieces that I know you've had presentations in the past in this forum on elements of the directive, and I'm not going to go down through all of them. There's too many there to address. I'm going to pick out a couple which I'll talk in more detail around, and I just highlighted these ones here. The risk-based approach, I mean, that's I suppose the big ticket item for this new directive. That's what it's based on. And we're going to have a look at that. We'll also look at access to water, and a few other elements of the directive that we'll touch quickly upon in this brief presentation. So the risk-based approach is, it applies across all aspects of water supply and basically underpins the Recast Directive. It looks at everything from the source catchment through the treatment and supply and all the way through to the domestic distribution system. And it's divided into a couple of categories. So one, the risk-based approach to water safety, then the risk assessment and risk management within the catchment, risk assessment and risk management within the supply system, so basically the distribution system and all of that. And then finally, and I'm not going to dwell on this one today, is the risk assessment within the domestic distribution systems. Because again, there's a recognition that you get the water into the house, there's still potential for that water to get contaminated within the domestic setting. So the risk-based approach is not new, right? The risk-based approach is a concept which was recommended by the World Health Organization water safety approach back in 2004. And the directive is based on that. And again, the application of the risk-based approach isn't new either. Like the EPA have Advice Note 8, which is the development of drinking water safety plans. So again, we're not going into brand new territory here. This has been done, and we know the language, I suppose, but we have to put that out there and get people conversant in what risk assessment is and what it means. So risk management and risk assessment, it's a continual process with individual and independent processes that are carried out to identify risks, assess them, manage them, and reduce those risks with respect to water supply. So it's a continuous process which we'll be living through in all water supplies over the coming years. And ultimately, we're asking a question, right? How safe is your water supply? And we're trying to use the risk-based approach to answer that question and to give us greater certainty and greater understanding of what our water supply entails, where the risks are, and how we manage around those to minimise them and basically provide clean and healthy water to consumers. Now, the next number of slides are relatively heavy, we'll say, on text, and I'm just going to touch on pieces. I'm not going to bore people by reading the slides or, as I said, go through it in that sort of detail. So I suppose the first piece here is article number 7, and it calls for us to undertake, as the water industry, for want of a better term, to undertake risk assessment and risk managements within the catchments. And the key piece here is that has to be done for the first time by July 2027. So I was asked a question at coffee time there about a group water scheme, and they've identified risks within their catchment. And they've effectively started the risk-based process and risk management and risk assessment. So they're ahead of the curve. No, they'll have to formalise it, and there'll have to be a way of doing this that's standardised across the industry. But again, that group is, they're ahead of the curve, and everybody else is going to have to come up to that to that standard and to that approach. The second part then is the Article 8 piece, which is looking at the catchment. It's looking at source protection, and it's looking at, when you go out into the catchment, looking at the risks, looking at the hazards, and identifying them. And it's probably easier to look upon this in terms of a map of a catchment. So we have to delineate the boundaries of the catchment that we're taking water from. Then we have to describe that catchment, understand what the activities within that catchment are: agriculture, industry, domestic, and again it comes back to the whole, domestic wastewater treatment systems. All of these elements are, impacting on the water quality. And then it's identifying the hazards that are out there in the catchment, and they're the potential sources of pollution or contamination to our water supplies. And then, it's not going to be one individual or one group of people who will be doing this. these tasks are currently being, outlined in detail, and they're going to be divided across the industry so that it won't all fall to one individual or one group of individuals to do all of this. There'll be national expertise will be drawn into this as well. So while it is a challenge for all group schemes, it's also you won't be on your own, because there will be, I suppose, a framework that says who to go to ask for help and how to engage in that process. And then I suppose the final piece of the jigsaw in terms of risk assessment that I'm going to touch upon this morning is the risk assessment and the risk management of the supply system. So again, this is an activity that will be carried out by the water supplier, so by the group water scheme. And it's probably easier to look on this as in terms of that diagram, because it's everything in the catchment or in the water supply from the point of abstraction through the treatment plant, through the storage, all the way through the distribution system out to the point of supply where the water enters the consumer's property. So again, it's to look at what are the risks and how are we managing them in terms of the water supply scheme, and then to minimise those risks through actions. And again, it's a process which we'll go through, and there will be guidance on how that process works and how that process is delivered. So again, it just is not meant to frighten people away from the process. It's to encourage people to be actively engaged in the process, so that they know each step along the way and they become familiar with the risks in terms of the actions that people are doing that are causing risks, and how to solve those risks or how to minimise those risks through the risk management and risk assessment processes. Again, and just to summarise on those, like, the key points is that there's a clear and appropriate distribution of the responsibilities across the stakeholders. One of those stakeholders is the group water sector. The group water scheme, another one is the National Federation. So the National Federation will be there to help. The EPA, the local authorities, the Irish Water, like all of these organisations will be involved in this. So it's not a journey for each individual on their own. And again, there are timelines on this. I mentioned earlier that the risk assessment and risk management within the catchment has to be done by July 2027. But then subsequently the risk assessment and management of the supply system has to be done by January 2029. And each of these risk assessments, so it will be a document that will live in the group water scheme, and they have to be revised and updated every 6 years, so that it's not something that just lives on the shelf and gets forgotten about. It's something that you'll keep going back to and you'll keep updating, because when you find a new risk, you'll log that, you'll look for solutions on how to minimise it, and you'll log what you did, so that when you come back to it the next time, that risk is gone. Other things will definitely have popped up in the meantime. So that's kind of the risk assessment piece. I'm just going to touch very briefly on the monitoring, because all of the group water schemes are doing monitoring in terms of water quality monitoring at the moment. So this isn't new. This is part of current business practice. There are changes to what's being done in terms of the monitoring. So the rationalisation of the microbial parameters. There's been some indicator parameters have been removed, and there are then parameters in terms of Legionella and lead, which are being highlighted for the next directive. And I'll come back to those in a second. There's a number of new chemical parameters that we're going to have to monitor for, and I'm not going to try to pronounce some of these, but again, there's dates upon which we have to do these, so they don't all kick in on January 2023. There's a 3-year window to where some of these kick in. So again, it's just to be cognizant of that. We don't have to rush out 1st of January to start looking for all of these things, but it's important that we know they're there. Then some of the standards are becoming more stringent. So chromium and lead, they're basically both of those standards will have by 2036 in terms of the allowable levels. And then a couple of parameters are becoming less stringent. So again, it's knowing this is the big thing, and then preparing for it through the group scheme management processes. That's the next challenge. access to water intended for human consumption is a new thing in the directive, right? This actually ties in very well with the programme for government, which is an objective of developing water fountains in public places to reduce the amount of plastic bottles that are in circulation. To be fair, a number of group water schemes have done this already themselves, so it's not new to the group water sector. And subsequent to that, I suppose, we'll be encouraging more group water schemes to consider putting in a water fountain in a location that's, you know, accessible to the community and providing, I suppose, a service to the community. One of the big things that the new directive requires is communication with the customers, providing information to the customers, right? So the customer needs to know the quality of the water they're getting on and be told this regularly. But they also need to know the volume of water they're getting and how their volume has changed, whether they're up or down from the previous year. So again, that's a piece of work that some group water schemes may well be doing already, but maybe not everybody is. So it's a new piece of work, and it will have to be implemented. One of the, I suppose, pieces of the legislation, and work is ongoing on this, there will be penalties under the directive. Like for non-compliance, there are non-compliance penalties at the moment, but again, they will be reinvigorated through the new directive and through the new legislation. And the important element of these, and as I said, they are being developed, is they're effective, they're proportionate, and they're dissuasive. And we've got to keep those in mind when we're developing them. And again, it's something that we have to, under the directive, transmit to the Commission by January, so they understand what we're following as penalties and under the directive. I'm nearly there. So it's just a quick summary. This isn't all of the responsibilities, but I suppose it's the ones that I'm kind of highlighting today. The risk assessment and risk management within the catchments and within the supply. There's work in that for the group water scheme. And there's responsibilities in that. And then there's, okay, compliance with the parameters is something that's there anyway, but again, just highlighting it because there's some changes in that. The provision of information to customers is a new thing in terms of water quality information on a regular basis and usage data. And finally, facilitating access to water. And again, that's something that we're going to have to develop further through the lifetime of the next directive. Most important key element here is the group water supply scheme is a water supplier. So when you see the directive, when you see the regulations, when you see when you see water supplier, read into that the group water supplier scheme. I'll leave you with two quotes. At the end of the day, water is life, right? There's no getting away from that, and we have to respect it. And it is nature, and it has to be. We have to respect that and ensure that it's sustainable. Thank you very much.